This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This episode is brought to you by the UK team behind the artisan Beta Cut pruning products. Still largely undiscovered by the UK market, they've recently been discovered by Selfridges in May of this year and they're now stocked there. The Beta Cut brand is the sign of excellent craftsmanship using traditional hot drop forging methods with the handmade cutting tools made in Erba, Italy, near the banks of Lake Como. Beta Cut has been a leader in providing steel cutting blades since 1955 and offers gardeners handcrafted products for those seeking that unique and traditional alternative. They're fabulous as a gift too. See the Pruner and Sharpening Stone box set in the show notes. As a special offer for listeners, Beta Cut is offering a special 20% off all orders placed via the website throughout August 2021. Visit the link in the show notes and enter the code ROOTS20, all uppercase, at the checkout. This week I visited Golden Hill Nurseries to interview Roger Butler. Yes, I actually did a face-to-face interview. What a treat. I'd been to Golden Hill a few years ago and was blown away by their amazing collection of hydrangeas, and I wanted to interview Roger, but what with the pandemic, opportunities were limited, so I'm really pleased to have got this one in the bag so that I can share Roger's knowledge with you. Find out about the different species in cultivation, the best way to prune hydrangeas, what and when to feed them, and of course the all-important information about whether your flowers will be pink or blue, and what, if anything, you can do about it. My first question is, where do hydrangeas originate from?
Well, the more common hydrangea macrophylla, comes from Japan. The smaller version of this is Hydrangea serrata, which grows in woodland conditions away from the coast. Hydrangea quercifolia, the oak-leafed one, is a North American plant, as is Peniculata, but there is quite a wide range. Some come from China. One or two come from Mexico, so it is quite a broad range. But essentially, what people see as Granny's hydrangea is macrophylla, and that comes from the coastal areas of Japan. And obviously there's quite a range of them, and I'm assuming they like different growing conditions, or are they fairly standard in that? Yes, hydrangeas generally like a lot of water. There is a clue in its name, but macrophyllas are better in partial shade because that is where they originate from. The same goes for serratas, but the oak leaf, the quercifolias and the peniculatas are fine in full sun, as are the arborescens varieties. And how about dry soil? Not too keen on dry soil. Plenty of moisture, plenty of organic matter around them when you plant them. But the peniculatas will do particularly well in full sun. The macrophyllas do tend to scorch on a hot day in full sun. And so you've mentioned some of the species. What are the main ones that are in cultivation? The main ones are in cultivation are the ones I've mentioned. Macrophyllas are the one that everybody knows about. Peniculatas are increasing in popularity, with plant breeding introducing a lot of newer colour breaks in the varieties. I'm going to come on to this more in later questions, but do you prune the peniculatas the same as you do? Pruning of hydrangeas is very important. Macrophyllas and serratas, you should do as little as possible pruning them, just removing the dead heads, and it's best to leave the dead heads on the plant throughout the winter and prune them off in early April. The next year's flowering buds are the buds close to where the flowers were, and the basal buds, if you cut them back, will just produce green growth. And do you need to cut out any of the older stems? You can thin them out. That's the only pruning that I would recommend for them. Whereas hydrangea peniculata and arborescens varieties, you can prune down to within 4 to 6 inches of the ground, which is probably the best way of growing those. You get the bigger flowers and the stronger stems by doing that. A lot of people talk about something like Annabelle, taking it right down to the ground every year. Is that the best way to,
yes, it is.
Deal with that?
Yeah.
Okay. Does that last particularly long? I've had a few and they seem to peter out after a while. the life of the flowers isn't that long with Annabelle, but it depending on how you prune them, depends upon the time of when they flower. But they're not a terribly long-lasting one. I would hope to see 4 to 5 weeks of good flower on them.
I've got a client who swears by chopping her hydrangeas right down low, and she doesn't care when in the winter she does it. But I think some people may have got caught out this year with the colder spring.
They most certainly would have done, yes. The best time to prune Peniculatas is between the end of February and the end of April, or even as late as the middle of May. The later you prune them, the later they will flower. So you can actually control the flowering of Peniculatas. Annabelle and the other arborescens I would cut down almost to the ground, 4 to 6 inches from the ground. I would do it in April.
And if they did get frosted, what would happen? Would you just lose the flowers that year, or could it potentially kill the plant?
This year there was a lot of frost damage on macrophyllus, which has taken out the flower buds quite clearly. But it is unusual, and that was exacerbated by the warm weather at the end of March, pushing things into growth early, followed by frost almost every night in April, and then a dull May when they didn't have any sunshine, and as a result this year the hydrangeas are flowered about 6 weeks late.
So getting on to the $1 million question, why are some hydrangeas pink, why are some blue, why do some start blue and turn pink?
Right, it's all down to the soil. The blue hydrangeas are grown in a compost that has a very low pH and has aluminium sulfate mixed into it. It is affected by irrigation water. If your water is very chalky, the effect of the bluing will go away. On an alkaline soil, most varieties are red or pink. You won't get any blue on an alkaline soil, and the more acid you get, the more intense the blue colour will become. You can influence them in your garden by growing them in pots in an ericaceous compost and watering them with aluminium sulfate regularly in the spring. However, you won't change the colour of one that's coming out pink this year by putting aluminium sulfate on it this year. It'll take a year to take effect.
So if you went to a nursery, saw the most stunning blue hydrangea and then took it home and you've got alkaline soil, there's just nothing
It'll
you
go
can
pink.
do. Yeah.
You can't do anything about it if you don't put it in ericaceous compost and water with aluminium sulfate. It's absolutely vital.
So that's interesting then. You could effectively, you just don't really know what you're getting until you get it home, and then it's trial and error. Yeah.
And if anybody tells you that they've got one that stays blue, it won't.
So if you went to a nursery and bought a pink one and took it home and put it in your acid soil, would it turn blue?
Probably, yes. Almost certainly. It might go purple, depending on how deep a pink it was or how close to red it was. But this is only in the macrophyllus and the serratas. The Peniculatas are the same on all soils, and the white macrophyllus and serratas stay white, whatever happens.
Interesting. Do you get a blue Peniculata? No. What is the colour range of hydrangeas then?
Well, they're going through blues, pinks, reds, purples on the macrophyllus and serratas, and the Peniculatas, which are very popular at the moment, come out either white or a greeny white, and as the flowers age, the colour changes, and there are 1 or 2 new ones that go really deep pink and are exceptional garden plants.
So are there any that you kind of avoid because the flower heads are so heavy, or is that to do with how they're grown?
To a degree, it is how they're grown and how they're pruned and how they're fed and how they're supported. If you're growing Annabelle, which is probably the top-selling hydrangea that we have, you do need to grow it through some sort of wire mesh support, because if you get a flower that is 30 centimetres across and it rains on it, it's going to be heavy and it's going to lean over, and it is important that they are supported.
Mm-hmm. And thinking about all the different species there are, how many months of the year could we have hydrangea blooms in our gardens?
Basically, you can get some of them out in flower naturally at the end of May, and you can still have colour on some of the macrophyllars as late as October, on the types that have hard flowers that remain and change colour as they age. The magical range, the magical 4 seasons range, generally come out in June, and they change colour 3 or 4 times, and in the autumn they're still colourful and actually look quite nice with the frost on them over the winter as well. And the latest trend in hydrangea breeding is bringing out repeat flowering varieties, and there are now we've got about 10 or 12 that actually start flowering early June, late May, early June, and will keep producing new flowers all the way through till the autumn.
Oh, would you need to deadhead those?
Yes.
Yeah, interesting. Are there any that you can grow indoors or under cover?
Well, hydrangeas are used as a pot plant and are forced, and you will see them in the garden centre or in florist shops for probably 10 months of the year. Flowering is controlled by cool storage and heat, and so if you put a dormant plant in cold store in October and bring it out in January in under glass, it'll be flowering sort of 10 to 12 weeks later. You shouldn't plant these straight out in your garden, though. You should keep them as, if they're forced, you should keep them as a house plant, and then once the flowers have started to die, you should cut them off and then plant them out in your garden.
Oh, and they'll survive fine.
Usually.
Are there any species that you think are overlooked, or that people should be more aware of because they're a really good plant?
I think at the moment, I think Peniculatas were overlooked, but now they've become very popular, and they're probably the easiest to grow. You really can't go wrong with the Peniculatas. You can with macrophyllars. You can plant them in too sunny a position or too dry a position, but Peniculatas seem to tolerate virtually any conditions.
How big do they get? Do they vary?
It depends on how you prune them. The best way, as I've said, is to cut them down in April to 4 to 6 inches. But if you let them grow, the taller varieties will grow to 12 feet, 14 feet. We've got a picture of a Magnolia grandiflora that's about 50 years old, that's made a small tree, and it is a really quite an interesting plant. But the bigger you let them grow, the smaller the flowers are. More flowers, smaller flowers.
Okay. Do you have a particular favourite? That's a tough question, isn't it?
Yes, I do. I think my favourite macrophylla is Magical Revolution. And it isn't a popular seller because it isn't the most showy, but the flowers last on it for 4 months, and it's a fabulous plant. And in the Peniculatas, I think I really like Skyfall, and I really like Vanilla Fraise, and I really like Limelight. To pick out, I grow 260 different ones, and to pick out a favourite out of those is quite difficult.
I know there's a trend at the moment for dried flowers. If you wanted to harvest some of the flower heads, would you be doing...
Yeah, you can. You can cut them in the autumn and hang them upside down in the airing cupboard. It works quite well. You have to try different varieties. They respond differently.
Uh-huh. And they dry beautiful colours, don't they?
Some of them dry to the most incredible colours.
Yeah. And you talked about the trend for the repeat flowering hydrangeas. Are there any other trends, I'm thinking maybe colours and things, that you're noticing?
Well, there is a new hydrangea paniculata which has been around 2 years called Frambousine, and it is an incredibly lovely pink, strong pink. Probably the nicest, in my view, the nicest coloured paniculata, but the supply of young plants is very restricted, so I wouldn't publicise it as much as I would if I could buy 1,000 young plants, put it that way.
So thinking about, obviously you've got a lot here. Do they have any particular pests and diseases?
They're relatively free of pests and diseases. Here we don't spray the plants with any insecticide. We let nature take its course, and we control what pests we get by introducing predators. So we introduce ladybirds to control greenfly, which works really well. But in your garden, you're not going to go out and spray them with a spray program, so you might find a few holes in the leaves where something's eaten them, but they're real tolerant plants, and they don't seem to be severely damaged by any pest.
That's good. That's really good to know. If you keep them in containers, apart from the aluminium...
Yeah, they need regular feeding if they're in containers, and I would not feed them with a high nitrogen fertiliser. I'd tend to feed them with a tomato feed most of the time. If sometimes you get a lot of chlorosis in them, which needs resolving by putting a stronger fertiliser on, and something which is very general, such as Osmocote, which will have all the trace elements which will take out the chlorosis.
And if they're in the ground, do you need to do anything feeding wise?
You need to feed them in the ground. I would suggest people feed with blood, fish and bone, or grow more, just general fertiliser in the late winter, early spring.
And you often see them in lawns, for example, or in shrub borders on their own. Do they play nicely with other plants?
Oh, they're fine. It's just that hydrangeas... I mean, the great value of hydrangeas is that you get a really long flowering period, much longer flowering period than most shrubs. And where they grow in conditions that suit them, there's nothing that is a nicer plant, but they'll grow as a specimen or they'll grow in a mixed border.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. So, can you tell us a little bit about your nursery here, and if people want to find out more or buy from you, how can they do it?
Yes, well, we're in Marden, between Marden and Goudhurst. We open to the public. We do mail order. We grow over 250 different hydrangea varieties. We also grow trees, shrubs, hedging plants, and a general retail nursery. If people visit us, they need to wear boots because the irrigation water can make it a bit slippery.
Excellent. And have you got a website?
Yes, we have signature hydrangeas, signature plants and signature shrubs, all.co.uk. And our general one is goldenhillnurseries.com.
Is there anything else that we didn't talk about you'd like to add on?
No, I don't think so. Unless you want to say something about propagation,
yes.
Because it is, it is quite easy to propagate them. And whilst I won't encourage people to take my livelihood by propagating them, they are fairly easily rooted from softwood or semi-ripe cuttings taken throughout the summer. So,
taken throughout summer, I mean, I've done it. Literally bunged in a pot of soil and left to their own devices. They're pretty good, aren't they?
In a polythene bag, in a pot of well-drained soil, water them in, and then put them in a polythene bag, blow in it and tie it off and leave them. And they should root in about 10 to 14 days.
Wow, that's quick.
And it's and quite easily. And the biggest problem is rotting off, but that sometimes happens. You've obviously got them slightly too soft if that happens. But,
and do you need to be careful about plant breeders' rights with some of them?
Well, it's only if you're selling them. Plant breeders' rights are to protect the introducer of a plant from somebody just propagating it in huge quantities.
As we were walking around the nursery after the visit, Roger pointed out how this year's strange weather has caused many hydrangeas to put on strong green growth, which is shooting up and in some cases hiding the blooms below. So if you have an excess of green growth on your hydrangeas this year, just know that you're not alone. Many thanks to Roger for taking the time to share his knowledge and for giving me a tour of the nursery. If you're local and can visit, I highly recommend it, and if not, you can order through their website or catch up with them at one of the flower shows. Thank you to you for listening and to Beta Cut for sponsoring this episode. Dr. Ian Bedford's up next, talking about the horse chestnut moth.
We'll all be well accustomed to recognising the signs and signals from nature that one particular season is coming to an end and another is about to begin. Many will be measured events, such as the appearance and the disappearance of migratory animals who follow specific climatical conditions, whilst other signs will be clear and obvious with the appearance of certain flowers and fruits. One sign, however, is a dramatic one that for thousands of years will have reliably informed civilizations throughout the temperate world that they should now be prepared for tough winter months ahead. And this is when the leaves on deciduous trees begin changing from green to orange, red and brown as they stop producing food and are drained of their chlorophyll. So it's perhaps rather puzzling that over the past 2 decades, this irrefutably dependable sign of autumn has been thrown into disarray by vast numbers of horse chestnut trees throughout Britain that now display their autumnal leaf colours during the height of summer. First noticed on a tree in Wimbledon during 2002, the phenomenon has steadily spread to horse chestnut trees throughout England and Wales, and is now beginning to appear in Scotland. However, taking a closer look at the affected trees reveals that their autumnal colours are actually the result of something living inside their leaves, which, as it eats its way through the cells within the leaf, creates oval-shaped, light brown patches that over the summer become so numerous that most of the tree's leaves become completely brown and shriveled. So who is the culprit? Well, it's the leaf-tunnelling caterpillars of an invasive little orange and silver-coloured moth called the horse chestnut leaf miner. The adult moths will have emerged to mate in late spring from pupae that overwintered on the ground amongst leaf litter. Each female moth will then have laid around 150 eggs on the horse chestnut's fresh, unfolding leaves. The tiny caterpillars that hatch from them then burrow into the leaves and start eating the cells within. Then, when mature, they tunnel out again to pupate on the outside of the leaves. With up to 3 generations being produced over the summer, the tree's leaves become progressively more damaged until they finally drop in autumn. Although there's no treatments to effectively control infestations of the leaf mining moth, we're not overly worried about them for the time being, since the infested trees are continuing to grow, flower and produce their conkers as normal. But it's the long-term effect that we can't be too sure of, which could possibly make horse chestnut trees more susceptible to other diseases. We also don't know much about the moth either, since remarkably, only 17 years before it first appeared in Britain, it was discovered in Macedonia and found to be a totally new species that had never been recorded in the world before.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.